This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/audio.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you could just email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. I'm really excited about our show today. Michael Finkel. You can find him at michaelfinkel.com. He's written several books, but the ones we're talking about today is A Stranger in the Woods, Extraordinary Story of the Last True Hermit. He found a hermit who lived in the woods by himself for 27 years. He's got a book coming out called The Art Thief, a true story of the love of crime and a dangerous obsession. Also another book that I just happened to stumble on when I was looking at his stuff today. Which one? It's a Mea Culpa, the true story murder memoir, Mea Culpa. So now these are all books that I'm fascinated by. Mike Finkel seems like a great guy. He's been very, very patient with me. We had a scheduling mix-up, then a technical mix-up, and he showed up a third time. So we have to have a special plaque from Michael Finkel or an award or something. Mike Finkel, are you there?
Ed, I'm happy to be here. I'll just take a cash payment. Really, it's not necessary for a plaque.
I'll send you a check. Okay. Mike Finkel, tell us about yourself. Who is Michael Finkel?
Yeah, please. My friends call me Mike. Michael's, my wife calls me that when she's a little bit upset with me. So I'm always like, when someone says Michael, I'm like ready to apologize. Michael Finkel's just my, funny, rhymey sort of byline. I think when I was growing up, the kids in the neighborhood made fun of me by, instead of playing like Marco Polo, they played Michael Finkel. And so I use it as my byline. I've been a journalist for 30 years, which is like 7 lifetimes of journalism. I mean, back in the day when there wasn't even internet and cell phone, to right up to today where everybody seems to be their own publishing company. And in the course of those 30 years, I've been really fortunate. I am a very curious person, as most journalists should be, and highly unfocused. I've covered wars. I spent almost a year in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks. Before that, I spent a lot of time in Palestine and Israel and the Middle East, covering the intifadas and the wars there. Then I became interested in crime and fascinated by the darker side of humanity. And then also I'm interested in the most cutting edge science, like, what's beyond the edge of the galaxy, what's inside of an atom, what's the smallest thing, what's the largest thing. I'm interested in very unusual individuals. You mentioned this art thief. We'll talk, I'm sure, about the hermit. Basically, wherever my curiosity sort of roams, I'm fortunate enough to be able to write a story about it. Sort of like old school, whatever really just piques my curiosity is what I am able to write about. And I'm happy to talk to you about those wide range between war and criminals and science and pretty much everything in between. So that's who I am. I live in Park City, Utah now, but I lived in France and spent 25 years in Montana where my 3 children were born. I have 3 teenagers right now in my house. So if you hear, well, they're at school right now, but if you hear a ton of noise, they've come home. I also have 2 dogs and a wife, so life is crowded.
2 dogs and a wife, not 2 wives and a dog. Michael Finkel, I got to tell you, man, all your stuff.
It is Utah.
What was that?
It is Utah, so everything's possible.
That's right. You're right up our alley here at the Opperman Report. All your stuff is like all of our stuff, so I'm really happy to have you here. Now, before we get into the book, The Stranger in the Woods, about this hermit, the extraordinary story of the last true hermit, I know you got a book coming up about The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and obsession. Tell us about that real quick.
I'll give you a little teaser. So one thing you should know about is I don't do historical things. If I can't talk to the person, him or herself, then I'll let another journalist recreate things. So I like to talk to someone. The greatest art thief of all time is now like 48 years old. It's a young guy named Stefan Breitweiser. He's French. He my elevator pitch about this book was like the second greatest art thief of all time stole from an incredible, like 13 museums, which is kind of a lot of museums to steal from before getting caught. But this guy, Stefan Breitweiser, stole from 220 different museums. He stole more than $2 billion worth of art. All of his crimes were taking place during the day. He's like a master of like sleight of hand. He's like a David Blaine sort of magician. And all those things are great. But what I really liked about Stefan Breitweiser is that he stole, at least he said so, for the love of art, and put this $2 billion worth of art. I mean, someone who's a full-time art thief isn't making any money. He lived with his mother. He had these little rooms in the attic of his house and put $2 billion worth of art up there. And I'm just going to tease you with this. The book is called The Art Thief, and you will never guess what happens in the end. And we'll just leave it like that.
Well, that was going to be my next question, man. What happened to this guy? But okay, we'll look forward to that. You promised you'd come back. The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and a dangerous obsession. I've become fascinated with art theft myself after becoming friends with the Turbo Paul, the art hostage, as his own podcast now on YouTube. I think I did the first radio interview with him too as well. Here we are, The Stranger in the Woods, the extraordinary story of the last true hermit. How did you stumble on this story?
I read a very small newspaper article from a local Maine newspaper. This was about 10 years ago in 2013. And every line of this tiny article seemed less believable than the last. Here's what it said. It said that a man was caught breaking into a summer camp, stealing food, and it turned out that this guy had lived in the woods of Maine. Now, for all your listeners, Maine is not warm in the winter. I spent most of my life in Montana, so I know about cold weather. If you can spend like a night or two out camping in winter in Maine, I'm pretty proud of you. A week is kind of amazing. A month is sort of insane. A whole winter is like off the charts incredible. This guy spent 27 years, or so he said, living completely alone in the woods of Maine. Had got caught breaking into, like I said, a summer camp, stealing a little food, as you can imagine, be hungry. Said that he had never spoken a single word to a person in these 27 years, except for once he passed a hiker and said, there's a grand total of what he said in 27 years. He said, hi, and was planning to live his entire life out there. And even more fascinating, he said that he never lit a fire. This is Maine we're talking about, for fear that smoke would give his campsite away, and was content. Now, all these things, like, this sounds like clear BS. There's just no way that someone can spend this much time alone. Could this possibly be true? Is this guy lying? What would be the motivation for this? What is going on? So again, I read this in a small Maine newspaper, and then, the last line of the paper, no surprise for a hermit, is that this guy is not taking any interviews, he's not speaking to anybody, and we probably never will know what happened. And so all of those things made my head explode as a curious man and as a journalist, and I resolved to see if I can plumb the mystery of what it was known as the North Pond Hermit, because he was found near the North Pond in central Maine. So that's my setup.
Okay, fascinating, because I spent a lot of time in Maine. And up there, even people who have homes, with fireplaces, they spend a lot of time chopping wood, buying wood. And you're saying that this guy never built a fire? How did he keep warm?
This is what he was claiming. Yeah. So I read this story, and again, this person was arrested stealing hamburger meat and cheese, so not big deal, but was put in jail and waiting. They didn't know if he was lying or if he was telling the truth, and so I wrote a letter to what they were calling the North Pond Hermit. His real name is Christopher Knight, Chris Knight. I was assuming that if any part of this was true, a guy living 27 years by himself in the woods, he was probably going to be crazy, yeah. Or not someone that you could hold an intelligent conversation with. But again, why, how is this actually true? How do you stay warm? Any of this true? So I wrote a letter, just a brief letter, to the jailhouse in Augusta, Maine, where he was being held, and it was basically like, "Dear Chris, my name is Mike Finkel. I'm a journalist. I live in Montana. I spent a lot of time outside, and I was just wondering if you would, answer some questions, if you'd be available to speak. And I'm like I said in the introduction, I'm a curious guy, but I don't expect to receive a reply to such a letter. I figured a guy's a hermit, he's not going to talk to anyone. So I mailed it off just out of curiosity. And between me and your listeners, I think one of the secrets of the world, by the way, I'm going to give this away right at the outset. Everybody emails, everybody calls, everybody texts, but what people don't do these days is they don't pick up a pen, put it on a paper, and write a handwritten letter, which is what I decided to do with this guy in Maine. I just thought he might be a technophobe. He definitely lived in the woods. So something about typing felt wrong. I just wrote it by hand. Also, when I was growing up, my mother always made me handwrite thank you notes to everybody who came to my birthday party, which I didn't like that task, but it turns out that it was a great life lesson. Handwritten letters really make an impression these days, because maybe 2 weeks after I mailed the letter to the jail, I received a reply with the return address, the Kennebec County Jail, from Christopher Knight, known as the North Pond Hermit. And I opened this letter, and within like 10 seconds, I knew 3 things. And the first thing was, he said basically, thank you for writing a handwritten letter. Those are always personal. And so I knew that 3 things I knew. First of all, from right away, that this guy was highly intelligent. His vocabulary, he actually had a little wit about him. He was sort of dryly funny. He immediately, started sort of making fun of himself. So I knew that this wasn't someone who was completely crazy. He had a great vocabulary. 2, he had an amazing story to tell. Just like little hints of his first letter, which was just a couple of paragraphs long, mentioned nearly dying of the cold. And so intelligent, great story to tell. And third thing was holding many, many mysteries, perhaps maybe even the secret. What's the reason we're all alive? You always want to ask a hermit on the hill, what's the secret of life? And so I was immediately, all those journalistic impulses were fired, and just from receiving one letter.
Incredible. I think we can do like 10 shows just on the hermit. What was his background, his family, his education?
Okay, so we exchanged letters over the course of the summer of 2013, right after he got caught, and then I ended up visiting him. And his background, very briefly, was Chris Knight grew up in rural Maine, not too far from where he was found breaking into a summer camp. Real true, like salt of the earth, blue collared, do everything yourself, independent, that sort of like classic American Walt Whitman spirit, you do everything yourself. So this family that he learned how to, they farmed, they fixed everything from plumbing to electricity. Also he and his brothers, I think it was a family of 5 brothers, 1 sister, mother, father. The father worked in was a military veteran, worked in like a creamery, no money, but they did everything themselves, from hunting to raising to growing crops. And also, I really love this. It sort of like makes me proud to be an American, this sort of style where they also really revered education and reading and books, while at the same time being a very blue collar, hands dirty family. And so he grew up in this sort of, kind of feels like old fashioned to me, where like you are able to do anything from, debate the New York intellectuals to, fix anything that's broken, which I think is a fascinating way to grow up, but also kind of very, no taking government assistance, that sort of ideal, but he was always a loner. He just felt more comfortable being by himself. So that's the background that he came from, Christopher Knight.
Yeah, Maine is like nowhere else in the country. Like you said, very self-sufficient, fix it yourself, and take pride in it. Take pride in going out in the winter with no coat. There is that kind of stuff over there. But what about his education? Did he have a formal education? Did he go to school?
Yeah, he got a high school degree, and by the way, first, before I even go on, I love the state of Maine. I got to tell you. And I spent 25 years living in Bozeman, Montana, and I thought Montana was my ideal state, but Montana lacks a coastline. Right. And Maine, I love the people there. It's also just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. I really can't say enough nice things about the people of Maine who accepted a outsider and spoke to me so politely. And I don't know. Yeah, so any of your warm feelings for a cold place, I totally agree with Ed. The state of Maine is lovely, and probably people that are living in Maine are right now cringing because the last thing they want is more foreigners, more outsiders coming in. So maybe I should just say it's a terrible place, don't go. But that's only with the heaviest of winks. So Chris Knight, the Hermit, only got a high school education, great student, and then went to like a technical school. And this actually plays a little part in his future. He learned how to install home alarm systems, by the way. So this comes in handy for his later career as someone who needed to acquire food. I'll be brief about this, but he was 19 years old, was in like the first year of this sort of post-high school technical school program to learn how to install alarms. And I don't know exactly what happened. He didn't speak to me at length about this moment, but decided, as probably many of us have this sort of feeling, that something reached a point of just too much in this. He just never liked really seeing other people. He really preferred being alone. And I'm a journalist, so I spend a lot of time writing by myself, but I love like yapping with you, Ed. I could probably, keep talking all night long and into the morning. You give me enough coffee and whiskey. Anyway, so he got in his car. By the way, his brother had bought him this car, and he owed his brother a lot of money, and decided to take a drive. And when you're 19 years old, you don't really make like these long-term plans. He basically drove his car. He was doing this technical program in Massachusetts. He drove south into Florida, just stuck to the highways, and then somehow decided to turn around and drive north, back up through all the states, back through New England, back through where he was in Massachusetts, up to Maine, past where he grew up to northern Maine. And I'm not sure exactly what hit him, but he drove his car off of the main roads, onto dirt roads, onto side roads, basically into the woods until it was almost out of gas, till the car was stuck deep in the woods, opened the door to his white, 1986 Brat. This was about the year 1986. Put the keys in the center console, closed the door without maps, a tent, food, planning, closed the door, walked into the woods. Wasn't seen again for 27 years.
Just incredible. Now, what about his family? Were they looking for him?
Yeah, so what did this guy do? What is his family? So Chris Knight, walks into the woods kind of, was he going for a weekend? Was he going for the rest of his life? He didn't know. He just knew that he wanted to leave the world behind. So he himself started wandering around the Maine woods. Now, not wandering lost. He's a smart guy, like as probably most of your, I feel like you have really savvy listeners, Ed.
Yeah,
so
I do. Yeah.
I just feel like you do. I don't know why. I just love your shows. I feel like the people that listen to you are just kind of open-minded, curious, self-sufficient people. So you don't need a map or a compass to know where you're going if you could read the stars. You know that the sun sets in the west and rises in the east. So you know east and west, and therefore you know north and south, and you know where the North Star is. So he wasn't lost and wandering in the woods. He was just able, Chris Knight, to sort of navigate his way through the woods, generally by his wits. Now, we'll jump around in time, but he never once in these 27 years, Chris Knight, the Hermit, made a phone call, told his family where he was, contacted a single person. And so, of course, his family, which I was in very slight touch with, they're very private, was worried. They even hired a private detective for a while. They never knew what happened to their son for 27 years. When Chris Knight, the Hermit's father, died, like 12 years after he disappeared, Chris Knight was still listed as a survivor in the obituary. So I only can imagine the sort of anguish that the family went through. Now, when I talk about Chris Knight, I wrote a book about him. I do speak of him with some admiration. That's not even I really am astonished by what he did, but that doesn't mean he's an angelic person. Like I will, as a journalist, I like to look at the whole of a person. So yeah, he kind of tortured his family, but that was the decision he made. Chris Knight later told me, we'll talk about how I got in touch with him, that if one time you make one phone call, you send one postcard, you make one contact with one person, then you're not truly a hermit. You're not disappeared. Once one person knows, then you've sort of ruined it. He wanted a pure escape from the world. It was almost, and again, I'm sensitive about things like suicide, but it was almost as if he had committed suicide without killing himself. He just separated himself from the rest of the world, as hard as that is to imagine. And we're not talking about for a week or a month or a year or a decade, but close to 30 years.
Now, what about like before he escaped civilization, in his high school years and his childhood? Did he have like romance, girlfriends, any kind of friendships with people?
I spoke to a couple of his friends. He was a classic high school loner. I wasn't the most popular kid in my own high school, so I sort of understand this. As far as girlfriends, I believe he did not. But I spoke to a couple of his friends, and they all said sort of the same thing. And I'm not going to even pretend to do a Maine accent, but I wish I could. Wicked smart. Sorry, everybody in Maine. I'm a journalist, not a mimic. So, super smart, super independent, quiet. It's like sort of that classic sort of nerdy, bright, independent thing. And so, not a threat to anybody, but a sort of like I think I mentioned Walt Whitman before, sort of an American original, that sort of like very independent, spirited person. Also 19 years old with a strong head. You can take kind of weird risks when you're in your teenage years. No family, no children. So I don't think he ever had a girlfriend. And we talked about that later. And remember, he left the world at basically 19 years old and wasn't caught. And we can also talk about how he got caught until he was 47. It's like that's basically the heart of your entire life. Before 19, you're basically a kid. And after 47, you're like me, like a middle-aged man. He spent the entire heart of his life completely alone in the woods of Maine. And then we'll talk about how he was able to survive without even lighting a fire.
That was pretty much the next question. Did he build his own structure? Did he stumble upon a structure?
So he left in about 86, which is when I graduated high school myself. And he's about a year and a half older than me. And it took him about 2 or 3 years of sort of working his way through the woods of Maine. And he didn't have a camping tent. He was, he left during summer, so it was sort of warm, but the summers in Maine are very short. So right away, he realized he needed food and shelter. Now, as I mentioned, he was brought up with a very strict family where, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. And so he was very hesitant, as he told me, to, let's just call it what it is, to steal, to take things that weren't his. But he also felt very, very strongly, again, I'm not going to make any moral opinions. Why don't you just get a job and spend, most of the time by yourself? But no, he felt so strongly that he had to be by himself, that it was more important to him to be by himself than it was to be strictly observant to the letter of the law. And so he started out by stealing stuff from people's gardens, which, that's barely a crime, snapping off some ears of corn, digging up some potatoes. He went into a shed and stole like a camping tent. So that's getting bigger crimes. And then eventually he sort of moved around the woods of Maine. And Maine, as you know, is wide enough, vast enough state so that you can actually remain hidden. Close to 2 years. And then one day, as he told me, it was like almost like a perfect moment. He could tell he was heading south. He knew which direction he was heading. And he said he could also tell by the bird song and sort of the tree density that he was sort of not too far from the part of Maine that he grew up in. He found this amazing spot. Turned out that it was on private property. He wasn't aware. It was like this Stonehenge circle of rocks, naturally glacially deposited rocks. The glaciers came in the last ice age, covered most of Maine, and when they retreated, they left these enormous boulders behind, with this one rock that was sort of split in half. If you looked at it from a certain angle, if you looked at it from most of the angles, it looked like a solid rock. You come around it, there's a big split in it. You could twist your body and walk through this split rock and into this almost, I kind of get chills when I think about it because I went there myself, this magical spot in the woods surrounded by these rocks through this secret passage between the cracked rock. It was sort of this room in the woods with dense The trees were dense, but it was a clearing, and there was almost a lattice-like ceiling where all the tree branches intertwined, so you were protected from the sun, slightly protected from the wind for winter, and he thought this would be the place that he would live maybe the rest of his life. Ended up setting up a tent there, never made a permanent structure. He made the most beautiful shelter you could ever make out of like things that he foraged and stole from never people's permanent homes, but like there was a bunch of what they call camps in Maine, which are like very modest summer homes. And he took like things like garbage bags and tarps and built this beautiful sort of, it looked like a church to me, church-like structure out of things that he foraged. And he lived under that structure for all these winters. And again, I'll let you talk for a little bit. Again, did not light a fire, and we talked about this at length.
Okay. Now, if the listeners go to michaelfinkel.com and they purchase a copy of this book, The Stranger in the Woods, The Extraordinary Story of the Last True Hermit, is there included in this book pictures of this dwelling?
No, but you can see these on my website, michaelfinkel.com. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So in my Art Thief book, I decided to have an insert with a bunch of photos. For some reason, I thought that The Stranger in the Woods, I don't know, it best live in the reader's imagination. But of course, if anything I'm saying to you sparks some sort of, I got to see what this looked like, I have plenty of photos on my website, michaelfinkel.com. You could also search on the web for Christopher Knight, the Hermit, Maine Hermit, North Pond Hermit, and basically, then we'll talk about everything. But the night he was captured, breaking into a summer camp, it was closed for the season, and stealing some things. He did mention where his camp was, and eventually led the police there. And so, before the police destroyed everything that was in this like magical clearing, they took some photos so you could see what it was like. I think I put on my website the police photos that were taken before everything was destroyed, and then I spent a lot of time there myself. So you will be able to see what Chris Knight himself looked like, the hermit, who was kind of a chameleon, and what his magical clearing in Maine looked like, where he lived for 25 of his 27 years.
And what did Christopher Knight look like? And what was his hygiene like? Was he able to shave, cut his hair?
Yeah, so the day, so it's sort of funny. I think when you picture a hermit, I think you think of someone with really long hair, maybe unkempt, somewhat dirty. Now, Chris Knight was I think it's really not very descriptive to say he was a nondescript person, but I think that's the reason why he got away with some of the things he did. White man, now he was 19 years old. He was thin, slightly under 6 feet tall. When he lived in the woods, yeah, hygiene is important to him, although one of the things that he told the police when he was captured, we'll again talk about how he was able to survive in the cold. One of the interesting things he told the police is that in 27 years he'd never gotten sick. Now, before the pandemic, this might have been harder to believe, but now you can believe this. So when we talk about cleanliness, we got to talk about it on two levels. There's like, dirt in your hair, and then there's the things that make you unclean, which is like viruses and bacteria. That's really what makes you unclean. And most of that, what makes you sick, is passed, as we know from the COVID era, is passed from person to person. So he claimed, and I talked to doctors about this, and they agreed, that in 27 years, he said, he never got sick. And that is because he didn't really have any encounters with humans. The closest he came was breaking into summer homes. And so, you can get things like cancer and diabetes, of course, but like in terms of like colds and sicknesses, he was healthier than any of us. Now, he also occasionally bathed in the ponds, had a big, he liked to take a big, those big yellow sponges that you sometimes use to clean your car, and would give himself sponge baths, and he even did his laundry, again, just by gathering rainwater, and his drinking water was usually gathered from rainwater, and when that water that he kept in like big plastic garbage cans that he also stole. 100% of the things he stole, he owned by the time he was captured. He had stolen everything. In fact, the police, said to him, "You got to return everything that's stolen." And he said, everything right down to my underwear has been stolen, except And so when, the police they catch this guy, they're interviewing him, they're like, rolling their eyes, like nobody lives for 27 years alone, nobody doesn't have an address, nobody could survive in Maine without a fire, etc. But then he said the thing that sort of changed the whole story, which is like, he said, the only thing that I can really claim is my own, are my eyeglasses. And he had these old clunky looking plastic framed eyeglasses that did look out of date. Remember, he got captured in 2013 and he left the world in the late 80s. And I mentioned he grew up in Maine, not far from where he actually was captured. And one of the officers managed to get a high school yearbook from the year that he graduated high school. And they flipped it open to his page. And there, in his high school picture, remember, this is a guy that's now in his late 40s, was wearing the same pair of glasses. And that moment when they realized that this guy was wearing the same pair of glasses as this kid in this picture, both police officers who were involved in the arrest told me that their minds completely switched over to this. Instead of this being a guy BSing, is now like possibly a true story.
I can believe he didn't catch a cold and that kind of stuff. But what about like a toothache? You scratch your cornea, you get an infection. What about stuff like that?
Ed, I love this question. So you're right. He slipped on ice a few times, hurt himself. Did actually have to have a couple of teeth removed because his diet was, we'll talk about his diet and we'll talk about how he kept warm, was basically foraging from other cabins. And so you are correct. Was there some amount of luck? Yeah, he said he once fell so hard that he wasn't able to pick up a coffee cup for a couple of weeks, but he never had a serious accident. If he scratched his cornea, he took care of it himself. He let his teeth be as they were, never went to a dentist in 27 years. And we'll talk about how I checked all these facts. We can get into that. Like, what proof do you have, Mike, that this is true? I think is a fair question for any of your listeners, but you are right. There was an element of luck and certainly of toughness. I think Chris Knight, the Hermit, was the perfect combination of like a perfect problem solver, had a great head for figuring things out and suffering, and also was quite physically tough, so mentally and physically tough. And again, you don't come across stories like this every day or ever because of many of these things. Like, I think any other state of the union, I think like Alaska would be too cold, too wild. I think something like Texas would be like there's just not enough trees and people are going to see that you're trespassing. I think Maine was like the perfect combination of privacy and enough sort of summer cabins around to survive that I don't think it could have been done anywhere else. But I will tell you how I know this story. What I'm telling you is not like maybe true or 98% true or 99.5% true, but everything I'm telling you, I am certain is 100% true.
Okay, then tell us, how can you be so sure?
Okay, so first of all, after exchanging letters with Chris Knight for a course of the summer, I visited him in jail while the legal system was deciding to figure out what to do with this guy. So I actually did 10 visits with him in jail and saw him personally. So I got to speak to Chris Knight personally and asked him anything that you might have in mind. I probably asked him, how did you survive? How could you live without a fire? How do I know you're not lying? Then, of course, I talked to the 2 police officers. Now, it's hard to prove a negative, like prove that you never slept in someone's house. However, if someone tells you a story that they never lit a fire, they never slept in someone's house, as soon as you go to their site and find one piece of charred wood, or you see one person's home security camera showing that a stranger, that he's sleeping in their room, one time you find one misstep, then the whole story collapses. Now, I worked on researching this for more than 3 years full time, and never once did I find anything that would refute anything that Chris Knight said. And then when I asked him the toughest of all questions, like how did you live without a fire? We'll get to that. He had explanations. How did you not get sick? How did you not see a dentist? He had very, very logical, reasonable explanations. And then I mentioned going to his site. There were things in his site, as the police officers pointed out to me, that were just almost irrefutable. Things like he hung up a clothesline, and over decades, the tree like grew around this clothesline. There was like a hammer that he had put claw side first into the side of a tree, and the tree basically grew around this hammer. These are not fast-growing trees. These things take decades. I dug through his, sounds kind of gross, but I dug through his garbage pile. He stole a lot of things for food from, like I mentioned, from summer cabins. And the great thing about like Twinkies boxes and Doritos bags is that they do not disintegrate quickly. And I dug and dug and dug. I dug deeper than my head all the way through his garbage bin and found like, decades worth of stuff. He stole a lot of magazines, newspapers, and books because he loved to read. And then when he was done reading these magazines, he would bind a stack of, like, say, picture like 20 National Geographics, a stack of them. You take some duct tape or electrical tape, also which he stole. You make a brick or like a cinder block of magazines. And what he would do is he would dig into the soil in his camp, and he would make this like subflooring out of bricks of magazines, which also allowed rainwater to drain through the soil and sort of dissipate out, if you're picturing me. So he made a flooring of magazines that he then covered with dirt, put like a carpet that he stole over this flooring, built his beautiful church-like structure, and slept in a place where it could rain as much as he wanted and everything would be drained. I dug holes in his site and found magazines way back to the early 80s. So I'm going to continue. So I'm waiting for one person to offer one shred of proof that he didn't do what he said. He's also, as both police officers said, this guy is truly private, didn't really even want to talk to me, wasn't looking for fame, didn't receive a penny from me, told me a story for free. He wasn't looking for money, fame, or anything, just wanted to be alone. He had no incentive to lie or make anything up. Anyway, I can continue with this ad nauseum, but I talked to people. I talked to people who were his victims, and anyway, I actually slept at his site for like a week just to feel what it was like and dig all these holes and find everything. And again, I didn't find one piece of charred wood. I found not a single piece of evidence to the contrary that anything he said was true.
I tell you, man, we're running out of time. I got so many questions. The only thing to do is buy the book, The Stranger in the Woods, The Extraordinary Story of the Last True Hermit. Real quick, now he's facing pretty petty charges, like these petty, robbery of a camp, like you said, youth camp, summer camp you called it, right? So he's got those pretty petty charges, right? But they're holding him there for some reason. Was he declared incompetent? And how did he get along with the other defendants?
Okay. Defendants, well, they're like other inmates.
Yeah.
Terribly. One of the reasons why he wrote me letters is he said he was having trouble communicating with other inmates. They were mostly younger, and they made fun of him because he, any reference to movies or television shows, he was completely lost on him. So he didn't get, and also he's truly a loner. He didn't really like, imagine taking someone who basically sacrificed their entire life to live completely free in the woods. Imagine locking that person up in a cage with another person. That's kind of torturous. Yeah. Now, you're right that it seems petty, stealing paperback books, AA batteries for your flashlights, and Stephen King novels and ground beef. But that's not the real crime. The real crime is breaking into someone's house. Even though Chris Knight, the hermit, was this is another thing that sort of perversely charmed me, I guess is the way I could put it. Like, he never kicked down a door. He never broke a window. He took these lessons about alarms. He was able to pick locks beautifully, or, slightly manipulate a window so he could open up the sash, crawl inside, and then he would not touch your computer, your jewelry, your cash, in fact, one time he stole a backpack, and he realized that the cabin owner's passport and his family's passports were in there, and he returned the passports but kept the pack. He didn't really want to. And then when he would leave a house, by the way, he would, if he managed to open the front door, he would set the lock so it would lock behind him so real thieves couldn't get in. Now, this is not to excuse him, but as you know, it's not what you steal. It's like breaking into someone's home one time, even to steal nothing, can be punishable by 10 years in prison. And he admitted to doing this over 27 years, close to 1,000 times. So they were completely confused, the legal system, about what to do with this guy, which is why they held him in jail. I'll tell you two things before we go, and I'll leave a million mysteries for readers of the book.
Yeah.
The Stranger in the Woods. Two things. One is he received a 7-month sentence in total. So that was not a terrible. In fact, that's how long it took the legal system to figure out what to do with him. And then they decided time served was enough. And by the way, the people that wanted him to go to jail for life, the people, owner of the cabins that were pissed, didn't think that was enough. And people that thought, this guy really never carried a weapon, was gentle, they thought that was too much. So, again, a sign of a good deal is when both sides are slightly disappointed.
What about his competency? Was that in question?
Never.
Wow.
Super bright guy, just didn't want to, just one of those people that just, and there's, by the way, history has been filled with people that have decided that the rest of us, to leave everybody else behind. Now, sometimes, not usually, for honestly, 27 years is about as long as anyone has ever been alone that I could find in all of history. But if you look at all of human history and see which people have felt this strong desire to separate themselves from everybody else, it's kind of shocking how much influence those, I'm talking about 1/100th of 1% of humanity really wants to escape from the rest of us, but these people that have wanted to get away with it from everyone for at least some period of time have had a profound influence on the rest of us. I'll just name 3 people from history that spent significant time alone. Let's go with Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha. We're talking about more than 2 billion people right now follow religions founded or started or influenced by those people. Jesus, as of course most of your listeners will recall, spent 40 days all alone in the Judean desert before he started gathering his disciples. That was his being all alone really was what transformed Jesus into Jesus. I himself, and of course Muhammad, meditating in a cave in present-day Mecca, and the Buddha also meditating by himself before, founding Buddhism. So this is I'm not putting Chris Knight up with these people, but I'm saying that, wow, hermits have had a profound influence on all the rest of us non-hermits.
When he was sitting in there awaiting trial, did he contact his family?
He said, this is interesting, and then I'm going to tell you how he survived without a fire. I'm really good at teasing this out. I'm not going to leave you saying, you got to write the book to figure that out. I'm going to tell you that much, and then you read the book to figure everything else out. Anyway, he said once he was captured that he begged the police officers not to contact he found out that his father had passed away, and his mother was still alive, and all of his siblings were. He asked them not to contact his family. The officer said why, and he said that he was raised not to be a thief and that he was embarrassed that he had stolen. Unfortunately, or fortunately, or whatever, the media, local media, as I mentioned, the Maine paper, got a hold of it, and so the officers were like, well, it's going to be in the media. So they did inform the family. The brother whose car had bought him a car eventually visited him in jail, and Chris Knight. He's kind of a combination of a sweet person and very rugged individual. Still felt bad that he owed his brother that money. That car that was abandoned in the woods was eventually found by some stranger and actually used. Many other little stories there. Now, really briefly, how do you? I'm talking about not just cold in Maine.
Yeah. I'm
talking about the worst kind of cold, wet cold. Maine winters are the coldest. They're colder than Montana. They're like Alaska cold. They're very brutal. How is my last bit up before I send everyone else to read the book? How do you survive one night, let alone, like I said, 27 winters? And so I asked him that, and this is what he told me, and I have no reason not to believe it. Smart guy, as I mentioned, Chris Knight. I'll talk to you in the book. You'll read about dozens and dozens of things he invented to keep himself alive, but this pure staying warm. Now, he's right. His secret encampment in the Stonehenge of Boulders was very, like, if you knew where you were going, it was like a 4-minute walk to the nearest cabin. There was recreational lakes around. He's correct. People searched for this guy, you know, private detectives and at least 3 different police agencies. Nobody found him. But if he had lit a fire, he was right. There's a highly probable that someone would see smoke from this fire. So I asked him how he survived. And Chris Knight said to me, it's not really, you know, you die from deep cold. And, you know, what happens when you die of when you freeze to death is, you know, basically hypothermia starts at your extremities. That's why your fingers and your toes get cold first, because it's the furthest from your heart. And then that coldness marches, you know, from your fingers and toes up to your heart, and you eventually freeze to death. And when we're talking about -20 Fahrenheit, which happens in Maine a lot, then you die very quickly. So Chris Knight trained himself. He did have a watch that he stole, so he knew what time it was. He went to bed every night in winter at 7 p.m. And then in the deepest, coldest part of the night, I think about 2 in the morning. So he'd sleep for, about 6 hours, 1 in the morning, 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. is about 6 hours by my calculations. When you and I, like, what do you do in the absolute depth of cold at 1 in the morning? Well, most of us would huddle in our blankets, you know, get like 6 or 7 sleeping bags that we would steal and like kind of cocoon ourselves into something. That's what I would do. Well, that'd be, according to Chris Knight, you know, when he made me guess at how he kept warm, I said, you know, just a whole bunch of blankets. He had this way of sort of lifting his eyes. He didn't like a lot of eye contact. And he would be like, you know, completely wrong, Mike, you know. If you try and huddle in your blankets when it's -20, you are going to die of hypothermia. So Chris Knight went to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening, woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning, the depth of cold. He had a little camp stove that he would light, and he would start putting snow in it to melt for drinking water. But what he would do is he would get up, put on his socks and shoes, put on his clothes, and he would pace around the outside of his camp along those stones of what I'm calling his Stonehenge, just around the walls of his Stonehenge, which he would pile up with snow. He would go around and around and around, walking around this thing all night, every night, all winter, for 27 winters, and he never lost so much as a toenail or fingernail to frostbite. He was just tough. He would heat water, that again, melting snow, sip on this water, and just pace the borders of his camp and not leave for like 6 months and just sleep from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. And that's how he was able to survive. And again, there's 100 more details. And if any of your listeners have questions, I would encourage them and be grateful if they would consider reading The Stranger in the Woods. And if they have more questions after that, go on my website and send me an email. I'm pretty good about getting back to people. I promise I asked the Hermit every question I could possibly think about on survival and tried to put it all in the book.
Yeah, I don't see how you could resist buying this book, The Stranger in the Woods, the extraordinary story of the last true hermit. What about the locals? Was there a legend of, hey, there's a guy up there living in the woods, you know, and these kids sighting him, you know, and things like that, like Bigfoot, you know what I mean? Anything like that?
Again, you know, there's so many things to talk about this.
Yeah.
So, Chris Knight, you know, Maine is very harsh. You can't have a garden in Maine. You can't even forage for berries. It's very difficult to even hunt. You know, a lot of people said to me, you know, if this guy just lived on public lands up in the north and hunted and fished for his food, they'd be fine with it. But what Chris Knight did, as I mentioned, his campsite was on private property. Actually, the homeowner, it was like 250 acres, never knew that this guy was there. It was just sort of, the woods there are extremely dense. We can get into the details about that. It's in the book, but he did not, Chris Knight, the Hermit, did not hunt, fish. He was an able hunter and fisherman, but he did not do that in his 27 years. He foraged in cabins, as I mentioned, and so broke into cabins a lot. And you know, I'm not leaving out the cabin owners' perspective on all this, some of whom were extraordinarily upset and some of whom seemed to understand. But yes, things were missing, like, you know, stakes were missing, and camp stoves and sleeping bags and boots and underwear. And he, you know, and not only did a legend grow about this North Pond Hermit, nobody knew if he was real or not, but like after 27 years, you're like, is there like generations of this? Is this like a practical joke? But people in the North Pond region like got to know him in the strangest of ways. Like, he liked creamy peanut butter, not chunky.
Wow.
He liked boxer briefs, not boxer shorts. People felt very violated, but also like kids wrote college papers about him. People that grew up with this quote unquote hermit had kids of their own. Someone got their Halloween candy stolen. There's all these like myths and legend. Was it like, was it D.T. Cooper? Was it, one of those hijackers from the 70s? Was it a Vietnam vet? Was this, nobody knew if he had a gun. Was he dangerous? It turns out he never even carried a weapon, but nobody had any idea. And a massive legend grew up about this person. But after, so many decades, somebody just figured it was somebody doing a practical joke or something, but it was really like a head-cracking mystery. There were, at barbecues and gatherings of the community that owned camps, summer homes around these ponds in central Maine. They would exchange stories of this hermit, and nobody quite believed it, but nobody didn't believe it. And it turns out, like, the strangest thing of all happened, which is that it was true. Imagine if, like, we do find a Yeti walking around Mount Everest, like we do capture a Yeti, or the Loch Ness Monster does suddenly like fly out of Loch Ness, and it's like one of those dragons from Game of Thrones. Like, I mean, or there is a tooth fairy. It's like this legend. The only thing crazier than the legend was the truth, and this guy was real, is real, and is still alive to this day. And I just want to say personally that I am grateful to Chris Knight, who said he was contacted by 500 journalists. I might be the only one who wrote him a handwritten letter and only spoke to me, and I will be forever grateful that he shared his story with me and allowed me to share it with the rest of the world.
Okay, Michael Finkel at michaelfinkel.com. We only got less than a minute. The Stranger in the Woods, the extraordinary story of the last true hermit. He gets out of jail. Where does he go? Do we know?
We do. Really briefly, he went back to his mother's house briefly, and he told me his story, and then we didn't become friends. He asked me. He said, "Mike, I've told you what I want to tell you. Now please leave me alone." And I have respected his wishes. So Chris Knight is still alive, and the only thing I can share with your listeners is that he has not returned to the woods. He's still living in society in central Maine. But one of the things he told me in our last meeting, has always stuck with me, that when the time is right, he said he's going to return back to the woods where he'll felt most comfortable and where he'll probably end up dying.
michaelfinkel.com. The next time we're going to hear from Mike Finkel is The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and a dangerous obsession. I'm looking forward to it. The book's coming out June 27th, but you can pre-order it right now if you go to amazon.com and make Mr. Bezos even richer. The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and dangerous obsession. But if you want to hear more about this one, it is the Stranger in the Woods, extraordinary story of the last true hermit. Mike Finkel, man, thank you so much.
Ed, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much to you.
Oh, dude, right up my alley. This is great stuff. I can't wait to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.